Scrub Dog of Alaska by Walt Morey, 13. David watched the Anchorage paper during the Fairbanks North American race for some word of Smiley Jackson and Scrub. He saw a list of race entries, but Jackson was not among them. He wondered where the musher had gone and what had happened to Scrub. Jackson was mad enough that last day at Anchorage to kill the dog. David was sure that Jackson was broke. The few minor races he'd won didn't bring in enough prize money to support a team until next winter. He guessed Jackson had sold the team rather than go to work to support them. Whether Scrub was dead or alive, Jackson feared he was gone forever. David feared he was gone forever. He put the little ivory dog in the top dresser drawer, but he couldn't forget Scrub. Nothing had changed for David. His aunt treated him well and never showed favoritism. His Uncle George was fine. But he was usually home only evenings, and no special bond developed between them. Terry paid scant attention to David. He skated nightly on the ice pond at his friend's home. After that first time, David never stopped again. Terry would speak briefly and even talk at home, or if they met on the street and Terry was alone. He barely said hello if he was with his friends. After dinner at home, Terry generally headed for his room to do homework. Sometimes he went to the home of one of his friends. Grace was the one warm, friendly person David felt close to. Her friendship helped fill the void created by the loss of his parents and Scrub. He met her every night at the bus stop, and they walked home together. He still helped her with math when she needed it. On Saturdays, David took her exploring. He showed her parts of the city that as a girl alone she would never have seen. They were watching a freighter loading at the dock one day, and Grace said, "I never would have seen a big ship like this if you hadn't come. Mom's afraid for me to come down here alone, and Terry won't bring me." When they hiked out of the city, Aunt Margaret cautioned, "You both be careful. There's moose around, you know." They saw several moose in the distance, but David steered well away from them. Grace had never seen a rabbit run. She knew nothing about setting a snare or a deadfall. He showed her where a weasel had chased and caught a rabbit. He explained how grouse burrowed under the snow to escape storms, and that sometimes a crust formed on top, trapping them. "Gee, David," she said, "you know a lot." "Dad knew more," he said. "All trappers have to know these things." David was acquainted with every street in the city, and now some of the businessmen spoke to him. He got more snow shoveling jobs, and he was often hired for a few hours to help uncrate merchandise or clean up a storeroom. The money he made was added to the roll in the toe of his muckluck. He had $140 now. David often worked in the hardware store. Several times when he was there, Terry stopped to look at the shotgun in the window. But if David went toward the front of the store, Terry turned away. David was surprised when he climbed the stairs one Saturday and found Terry standing in the middle of his room looking around. Startled, Terry stammered, I thought I heard you up here. I just got home." Terry crushed the cap in his hands and looked around. "You've got it pretty nice up here." He glanced out the window. "You can see almost all the way downtown." "Didn't you ever come up here before?" David asked. "What do you mean?" "I told you, I thought I heard you up here." "I mean, before I came," David asked. Terry shook his head and muttered, "Maybe once or twice. I guess I never bothered to look out the window." David sat on the bed and waited. Terry seemed nervous and ill at ease. Dave, how'd you like to go on a rabbit hunt some Saturday?" "I don't have a gun. I guess mine's at Scotty's now." I'll borrow Dad's shotgun. We can take turns. Rabbits will be good only a couple of weeks longer. Spring's coming." "I'd like it fine," David said. "When do we go?" "I'll let you know." Terry hurried back down the stairs. So Terry had finally decided to become friends, and found it embarrassing, David thought. He was glad his cousin had come up to his room. 2 weeks went by, and Terry said no more about the hunt. David reminded him, "If we don't go on that rabbit hunt soon, it'll be too late." "It almost is now." "What?" Terry said. "Oh, yeah, the rabbit hunt. I guess it's off." He gave no further explanations. Warm winds blew over Anchorage. The snow in the streets began to thaw. Water ran in the gutters. Those who'd been wearing parkas and mucklucks put them away for thinner clothing. Mr. Andrews at the hardware store hired David to help put away the winter ski and other sports equipment. He didn't finish that day. Mr. Andrews gave him $5 and said, "Come back in the morning, Dave. We've got about half a day's work yet." That night, when David went up to add the $5, to the rest in his muckluck. There was no roll of bills in the toe. He checked the other muckluck. The money was not there either. He sat on the bed and tried to think. He remembered having put $5 away just a week ago. He counted his money a number of times, but he always returned it to the muckluck. To make sure he hadn't misplaced it, he searched the room. He went into every dresser drawer, looked under the mattress, the pillow, in the pockets of his spare clothing. He found nothing. He wondered about rats or mice. Pack rats would carry off things, but he hadn't seen a rat or any sign of one, and he'd heard no sound to indicate they were about. Mystified, David finally went to bed, but he couldn't sleep for thinking about it. He was still worried next morning when his aunt asked, "Is anything wrong, David?" "No," he said uncertainly. "Maybe you're sick?" Grace offered solicitously. "For gosh sakes," Terry said, "Dave looks all right." When Terry and Grace left for school, David returned to his room for another quick look in daylight. Maybe he'd missed someplace. He found nothing and finally left for work at the hardware store. He finished his job in the early afternoon and Mr. Andrews paid him. As David started to leave, he glanced in the big display window. Something was different. He looked the window over carefully. The little shotgun was gone. He pointed at the spot and asked Mr. Andrews, "What happened to the shotgun?" "Sold it the other day. Thought I never would. It was pretty small. I was about to give up on it when this kid walked in and bought it." "A kid?" David asked. "About your age. It was really a kid's gun. Too light for a man." David went down the street. He reached the corner and waited for the light to change. Then it came to him. At first he was a little sick, then angry. He glanced in the jewelry store window at a clock. Grace would be getting off the bus in another half hour. He didn't want to meet her today. David turned off the main street and headed toward home. He walked 6 blocks, then entered a small grove of trees and sat down on a stump. In a few minutes, Grace came by, swinging her books and looking about for him. She disappeared around the corner. Some minutes later, Terry and his 3 friends wandered down the street. They stopped in front of the house where they'd skated all winter and talked. Then Terry hurried off alone. He returned carrying a gun. The 4 boys went to the end of the street and out across the open country. David followed far behind. The boys finally stopped and began tossing cans and bottles into the air. They took turns shooting at them. David returned to the grove of trees and sat down to wait. It was almost dark when the boys came back. They split up in front of the house, and Terry went down the street with the gun. David followed. Finally, a block from home, Terry turned into a vacant lot. David ducked behind a bush and watched. Terry went to the back of the lot to a deserted cabin. He stopped at the door, looked all around, then ducked inside. David ran noiselessly for the cabin. When he burst through the door, Terry had wrapped gunny sacks around the gun and was in the act of hiding it under a pile of old rags. Terry stared at David, mouth open in shocked surprise. David pointed at the gun and said angrily, "So that's where my money went. You sneaked up to my room and stole it and bought that gun." Terry found his voice then. "You're a liar," he shouted. You were looking for my money the night I came home and caught you," David went on. "You figured to steal it then, but I came home too soon. That invitation to go rabbit hunting was the only excuse you could think up in a hurry." "That's a lie," Terry yelled. David advanced, his fists clenched. "I had almost $160 in that muckluck. Where's the rest of it?" "I don't know anything about your old money." Terry began backing away. David hit him, and Terry's head cracked back against the logs. He hit him again. "Where's that money?" Terry dropped the gun, ducked his head, and charged into David. Both boys went down in a tangle of arms and legs. They were almost matched for size and strength, but David was fighting mad. He rolled on top of Terry, pinned him to the floor, and began banging his head up and down, demanding, "Where's my money? Where is it?" Terry tried to roll him off, but he was pinned, solid and helpless. David's savage anger and the fierce head-pounding frightened Terry. He cried, "In my pocket! In my pocket!" David ripped the handful of bills from Terry's pocket, but in so doing, lost his pinning hold. Terry rolled him off, jumped to his feet, and dashed out the door. David rushed after him, stuffing the money in his pocket. Terry charged blindly across the vacant lot for home, with David tight to his heels. Neither boy saw the car coming until they were right on it. Brakes squealed, the car door opened, and Uncle George stepped out. Both boys pulled up panting. Uncle George looked sharply at Terry, saw his scratched face, bloody mouth, and eye that was beginning to puff. He looked at David and asked very quietly, "What goes on here?" David panted, "He sneaked into my room and stole the money I'd been saving and bought a gun. It's over there in that old cabin." Terry wiped a smear of blood from his mouth with the back of his hand and said, "He's lying, Pa." Uncle George looked at Terry. Is there a gun in that cabin? Terry nodded. I bought it with my own money. Get it, Uncle George said. Pa, I did buy it. It's mine. Get it, Uncle George repeated. Terry returned to the cabin and got the gun. Now both of you get in the car, Uncle George said. We're going home. Aunt Margaret looked at Terry's face when they entered the kitchen and said, Good heavens, Terry, whatever happened? Uncle George said, Wash up, Terry, then come into the living room. George, Aunt Margaret demanded, what happened? Whose gun is that? We'll get those answers in a minute, Uncle George said grimly. In the living room, David sat tensely at the end of a chair. His Aunt Grace sat on the davenport. Terry sat on another chair, dabbing with a towel at his swollen lip. Uncle George stood. Now then, he looked at David. You say Terry stole the money you've been saving and bought this gun. How do you know that? After I gave you and Aunt Margaret $250 and bought my clothes, I had $104 left. I hid $90 in my muckluck and kept $14 in my purse. I made some money shoveling snow and working in stores, cleaning up and things. I put that in the muckluck with the rest. The money's gone and Terry's got the gun. I came home a couple of weeks ago and caught him in my room snooping around. I went up to invite you on a rabbit hunt, said Terry angrily. That we never went on. David looked at his uncle. He had the rest of the money in his pocket. I took it away from him in that old cabin. You're a liar, Terry shouted. I earned that gun. David, his aunt said, shocked. You're calling Terry a thief. I'm sorry, David said. Uncle George held up a hand. How much did you have in the muckluck, David? About $160. You say you took the rest away from Terry? How much do you have now? I don't know. David pulled the wad of bills from his pocket and handed them to his uncle. The gun cost $78. That's all he ever had, Terry shouted. He had it in his own pocket all the time. He's making this whole thing up, Pa. Be quiet. Uncle George calmly counted out the money and laid it on the table. $79, he said. He bought a box of shells, David said. Uncle George looked at Terry. All right, now let's have your side of it. I earned that money, Terry said angrily, no matter what he says. How did you earn it? Why, I worked, Pa. What did you work at? Gee, Pa, the same things Dave did. I know about David's work. Tell me about yours. Well, I saw Dave working around shoveling snow and things, and I did it too. I saved the money and bought the gun. I've been wanting it for months. Why didn't you bring it home? You'd have taken it away from me. You said I was too young for a gun, remember? And I meant it. Go on. That's all, Pa. I earned the money working around after school at stores and places. You and ice skating every night with your friends over at Dolan's, David said. I saw you. You saw me a few times, Terry said. Not every night. That money right there is all you've ever had. He turned to his father. He wanted that gun too, Pa. He was mad because I got it, and he followed me to that old cabin and started beating me up. You did that to Terry's face? Aunt Margaret said, shocked. I'm not going to sit here and have my son made out a thief and liar and then beat up by some half-breed Indian. Margaret, Uncle George said sharply, we'll have no more of that. Well, it's true, her blue eyes snapped. He is a half-breed, and you're standing there letting him call your son a liar and a thief and doing nothing about it. David happens to be my brother's son, Uncle George said flatly. He's as welcome here as any niece or nephew of either of us. Certainly David's half Indian, but I'm not going to have that word thrown around here as if it was something to be ashamed of. There are a few things you'd better start learning if you expect to live up here. There are some things I'll never learn, Aunt Margaret said in a level voice. You may just as well know it now, George. David felt sick. He thought his aunt was used to the fact that he was half Indian. Now he knew she'd been hiding her feelings until this moment. The family was quarreling over him. If only he'd lost his temper when he saw if only he hadn't lost his temper when he saw Terry with the gun. He said to his uncle, Terry can have the gun. His uncle handed him the money. That's not the point, David. Tomorrow morning we're going downtown to settle this. Do you remember the places you worked? Yes, David said, all of them. We'll check them out to make sure you're telling the truth. He turned to Terry. You said you worked. We'll check yours out too. You're taking David's word for this, Aunt Margaret said angrily. You're condemning your own son. I'm condemning no one, Uncle George said. I'm getting to the bottom of this. One of those stories won't hold up. I can't remember all the places I worked, Terry complained. Why? David can. David's had nothing else to do all day, so he remembers, Terry said. I went to school and worked nights and Saturdays. You'd better remember enough to make the price of this gun, Uncle George said. Aunt Margaret bit her lip. You're taking sides, don't deny it, Uncle George nodded. The side of the one telling the truth. We'll learn who that is tomorrow morning. Is dinner ready, Margaret? Margaret started to say something, then she rose abruptly and went into the kitchen. Terry followed her. Grace still sat on the davenport. She looked like she was going to cry. Out and wash up, honey, Uncle George said. Dinner will be ready soon. Grace left without a word. Come on, David. David shook his head. He couldn't sit at the table and eat with them now. I can't, he said. Uncle George nodded. I understand. I'm sorry about this, David. David climbed the stairs to his room. He closed the door, lay full length on his bed, and stared out the window. The lights of the city had come on and threw a high fan into the dark sky. Headlights intermittently probed the street. It was quieter downstairs than usual. Occasionally a voice funneled up the stairwell. The anger and shock of this evening depressed them all. An hour or so later, Uncle George climbed the stairs and entered the room. He stood tall and lean in the dark and looked down at the boy. He reminded David more than ever of his father. Not hungry yet? He asked gently. No. His uncle sat in the chair at the head of the bed. If you get hungry during the night, go downstairs and raid the refrigerator here. Yes, about your aunt. She didn't mean to sound as severe as she did. She's been in Alaska less than 2 years. The change has been pretty rough on her. She's got to learn about the North. We have to give her more time. She'll come around. I wish I'd kept my mouth shut, David burst out. Terry can have the gun. I don't want it. As I said before, that's not the point. If Terry took your money, I want to know it. He'll earn it somehow and pay back every dime. We'll straighten this out in the morning and everything will be all right. It's not a tragedy, just a problem. Families have them all the time. We had